Imagine stepping into the world of computers in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Back then, technology wasn't the open playground we know today. Instead, it was gated, expensive, and heavily controlled by corporations. If you wanted to run a computer, you had only a handful of choices, none of them truly free, and none designed for ordinary people with limited resources. At the top of the food chain were giants like Microsoft and Apple. Microsoft's Windows was quickly becoming the household name, while Apple offered sleek but tightly controlled machines. In universities and research labs, another system, Unix, dominated. Unix was powerful, stable, and respected by engineers, but it came with a price tag so steep that only institutions and corporations could afford it. For most students and hobbyists, this reality was frustrating. If you wanted to learn, experiment, or build something of your own, you were at the mercy of these corporate systems. You couldn't simply peek inside the code to see how it worked. You couldn't freely tinker, share, or adapt it to your own needs. In short, computers were not yet democratic. They were tools of the privileged few, locked behind walls of money and licensing agreements. This was the world that a young student in Helsinki, Finland, Linus Torvalds, was born into. He wasn't part of Silicon Valley, he wasn't sitting in a shiny corporate office, and he didn't have a team of engineers at his side. What he did have was an insatiable curiosity and a belief that computing should be something more than just a product sold to the highest bidder. At the time, many in the tech community were already whispering about the need for something different. People wanted a system that wasn't shackled by licensing fees or corporate gatekeepers. They wanted a system that was reliable, flexible, and most importantly, open. A few small projects were experimenting with this idea, but none had yet managed to break through the walls of the establishment. That tension, the clash between closed, expensive systems and the dream of something open, set the stage for what was about to happen. And it's this backdrop that makes Linus Torvalds' story so remarkable. Because when he sat down in 1991 to start writing code on his modest personal computer, he wasn't trying to launch a global revolution. He was just a frustrated student who wanted better tools to learn and explore. Yet history has a funny way of rewarding curiosity. The world before Linux was a landscape of limitations, and it took one teenager's persistence to crack it open. What began as a personal experiment would soon grow into one of the most important movements in modern technology, reshaping not just the way we build software, but the way we think about ownership, collaboration, and freedom in the digital age. Chapter 2: The Boy Scout from Helsinki. To understand why Linus Torvalds could create something as transformative as Linux, we need to step back and look at the boy behind the code. Linus was born on December 28, 1969, in Helsinki, Finland, a country known for its quiet resilience and its culture of resourcefulness. He wasn't born into wealth or luxury. Instead, he came from an ordinary family with deep intellectual roots. His parents, Niels and Anna Torvalds, were both journalists, part of Finland's educated middle class. They encouraged curiosity, reading, and critical thinking. But unlike the stereotypical image of tech geniuses who rebel against school, Linus thrived in academic environments. From an early age, he was fascinated by mathematics and logic. Numbers made sense to him in a way that the chaos of the world didn't. Linus was also, by all accounts, a quiet child. Friends and teachers often described him as shy, thoughtful, and unusually disciplined for his age. He wasn't the loud, show-off type. Instead, he approached problems the way a Boy Scout might approach a knot, methodically, patiently, and determined to get it right. That's where the nickname the Linux Boy Scout comes into play. He lived by principles of clarity, honesty, and precision. If he didn't know something, he didn't fake it. He simply learned it. This personality trait, discipline without arrogance, would later become crucial when Linux began to attract contributors from all over the world. People trusted Linus not because he was flashy, but because he was fair, consistent, and deeply committed to the craft of programming. His first brush with computing came not with a flashy Apple Macintosh or an IBM PC, but with a Commodore VIC-20, one of the modest home computers of the early 1980s. It had only 5 kilobytes of memory, a fraction of what your average email uses today. Most kids at that time might have used it for simple games. Linus, however, wanted to understand how those games worked. He dug into manuals, typed out long strings of code from magazines, and experimented with making the machine do exactly what he wanted. By his teenage years, Linus had moved on to more advanced systems like the Sinclair QL. He wasn't satisfied with just using programs. He wanted to tweak and improve them. In one famous instance, he grew frustrated with the limitations of the QL's operating system, so he rewrote large parts of it just for his own use. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply his way of learning, by tearing things apart and rebuilding them better. Unlike many of his peers, Linus wasn't dreaming of starting a company or becoming rich. His motivation was pure, curiosity and the joy of solving problems. That purity would later resonate with thousands of programmers around the world. By the time Linus entered the University of Helsinki in 1988 to study computer science, he was already more advanced than many of his professors in practical coding skills. But university gave him something he couldn't get on his own: access to powerful computers, books, and most importantly, a community of fellow students who were equally passionate about computing. It was during these years that his philosophy of software began to crystallize. He believed technology should not be locked away behind paywalls and licenses. It should be a tool that anyone, anywhere, could learn from and improve. This mindset put him in sharp contrast with the growing corporate culture of Silicon Valley, which was rapidly commercializing software. In Helsinki, far removed from the hype of California, Linus quietly built the foundations of what would later change the world. He was the Boy Scout of computing, methodical, honest, endlessly curious, and unshaken by ego. And when he finally put his skills and philosophy to the test, the results would send ripples across the entire technology landscape. Chapter 3: The Spark, a Teenage Idea. By 1991, Linus Torvalds was just another 21-year-old student at the University of Helsinki, navigating lectures, assignments, and the occasional late-night coding session. He wasn't famous, he wasn't backed by investors, and he certainly wasn't imagining that history would one day remember his name. What he did have was a brand new computer and a very specific frustration. Linus had recently purchased an Intel 380-86-based PC. A modest machine for its time, but powerful enough to spark his imagination. Like many computer science students, he wanted to experiment with operating systems. The problem was, the best ones were either locked away by corporations or priced far beyond the reach of a student's budget. At the university, Linus had access to Unix, the professional-grade operating system that ruled research labs and corporations. It was stable, flexible, and highly respected. But Unix was also proprietary. A single license could cost thousands of dollars, and students like Linus couldn't afford to bring it home. On the other end of the spectrum, there was MS-DOS, the operating system bundled with most personal computers. But DOS was limited, clunky, and nowhere near as sophisticated as Unix. For a budding programmer who wanted to explore the deepest workings of a computer, it felt like being handed a tricycle when what you really wanted was a motorcycle. Linus found himself stuck in the middle. He craved the power of Unix, but all he had was DOS. For most students, that would have been the end of the story. They would have accepted the limitations, studied what they could, and moved on. But Linus wasn't like most students. He had the persistence of someone who couldn't leave a puzzle unsolved. Around this time, he discovered a project called Minix, a simplified version of Unix designed for teaching. Minix was affordable and available to students, but it was intentionally restricted. Its creator, Andrew Tannenbaum, had designed it as an educational tool, not as a platform for building real systems. For Linus, it was both a gift and a frustration. It gave him a taste of Unix, but not the freedom to push it further. So Linus did what he always did when he hit a wall. He started tinkering. At first, his goal wasn't to build a global operating system. He simply wanted something better for his own machine. He began writing small programs that allowed him to interact with his PC at a deeper level, programs that could control the hardware directly, bypassing the limitations of DOS and Minix. These early experiments grew into something larger, a kernel, the core of an operating system. Piece by piece, line by line, Linus wrote the foundation of what would later become Linux. He worked tirelessly, not for fame or profit, but because he wanted a tool that actually worked the way he imagined. And then came the moment that changed everything: his post on Usenet, the online discussion forum of the early internet. On August 25, 1991, Linus typed out a message that would go down in history. He wrote, "Hello everybody out there using Minix. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU, for 386, 486 AT clones." It was almost casual in tone, as if he were inviting a few friends to join a weekend project. No grand vision, no sweeping promises, just a hobbyist sharing his work. But that humility was exactly what made it compelling. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't building a company. He was simply creating something useful and offering it to anyone who cared to try. That one post lit a spark. Developers and students from around the world saw his message, downloaded his early code, and began contributing ideas and improvements. What had started as a personal experiment in a student's bedroom was now, slowly but surely, turning into a community project. Linus didn't know it yet, but he had just set in motion a movement that would challenge the very foundations of how software was built and shared. The teenage idea, the kernel he had started writing for himself, was about to grow into one of the most important operating systems the world had ever seen. Chapter 4: The Birth of Linux. When Linus Torvalds released his first kernel to the world in 1991, he could not have imagined how quickly it would evolve. What began as a humble experiment, a personal project to make his Intel 386 computer more useful, was about to take on a life of its own. The world was ready for something different, and Linux arrived at exactly the right moment. The magic ingredient was openness. Unlike commercial systems such as Microsoft Windows or proprietary Unix, Linus made his code freely available. Anyone could download it, test it, and even modify it. This approach wasn't entirely new. The GNU project, started by Richard Stallman in the mid-1980s, had already planted the seeds of free software. But Linus's kernel gave those ideas a practical, working foundation. This distinction matters. Stallman had envisioned a free operating system, but the GNU project was incomplete without a functional kernel. Linus unknowingly supplied that missing piece. And by licensing Linux under the GNU General Public License, GPL, he ensured that it would remain free forever. No company could seize it, wall it off, or charge licensing fees. Anyone who improved Linux was required to share those improvements with the community. This decision was revolutionary. In the early 1990s, the software world was dominated by secrecy. Corporations treated code as treasure, hiding it behind paywalls and contracts. Linux was the opposite, a living organism that thrived on transparency. Developers around the globe began contributing patches, bug fixes, and enhancements. It was chaotic at first. Hundreds of strangers, connected only through dial-up internet and Usenet forums, were now shaping the same project. But Linus had a unique gift for organization. Though young, he quickly established himself as a fair and competent leader. He reviewed contributions, accepted good ones, and rejected those that didn't meet his standards. His disciplined, no-nonsense approach gave Linux the structure it needed to grow without collapsing under its own weight. The community model became Linux's superpower. A student in the US might improve file handling, while a researcher in Germany worked on networking. Someone in Japan might optimize performance for specific hardware, while a programmer in Brazil squashed bugs. Each contribution, no matter how small, added to the whole. And unlike commercial products, which might release updates once or twice a year, Linux improved almost daily. By the mid-1990s, Linux was no longer just a hobbyist's toy. It was spreading through universities, embraced by researchers who loved its flexibility. System administrators discovered that Linux could run on inexpensive hardware, saving organizations huge amounts of money. Soon, internet service providers, web servers, and even corporations began experimenting with it. Still, the mainstream tech world was skeptical. Critics dismissed Linux as unstable or amateurish. How could a project built by volunteers compete with billion-dollar companies? But the reality told a different story. Linux proved to be remarkably stable, secure, and adaptable. Each time skeptics tried to poke holes in it, the global community patched them faster than any single company could. What truly made Linux unstoppable was that it was not owned by anyone. Microsoft could be sued. Apple could be pressured. IBM could be bought out. But Linux, it belonged to everyone and no one. The code lived on thousands of computers worldwide, constantly evolving. It was like a seed that, once planted, could never be uprooted. By the late 1990s, the momentum was undeniable. Corporations that had once ignored Linux began to take it seriously. Tech giants like IBM invested heavily, recognizing that open-source collaboration was not a fad, but the future. The birth of Linux was no longer just the story of a Finnish student. It was the story of a movement that challenged how technology itself was created and shared. And at the center of it all remained Linus Torvalds. Modest, disciplined, and still insisting that he had simply built a hobby project. The world, however, knew better. Linux was born, and the digital landscape would never be the same. Chapter 5: Why Linux Succeeded Where Others Failed. The history of technology is littered with promising projects that never made it. Brilliant programmers, ambitious startups, and even billion-dollar corporations have tried and failed to build operating systems that could stand the test of time. So why did Linux, a project started by a 21-year-old student with no funding, succeed where others collapsed? The answer lies in a unique blend of timing, philosophy, and community. First, let's talk about technical brilliance. From its earliest days, Linux was designed to be stable, efficient, and flexible. Linus Torvalds had an instinct for clean, elegant code, and his obsessive attention to detail set a high bar. Unlike bloated systems that grew slower with every release, Linux was lean and powerful. It could run on modest hardware that commercial operating systems often ignored. That adaptability meant Linux was useful not just to hobbyists with old machines, but also to researchers pushing the limits of new hardware. Second, Linux carried a philosophical appeal. While Microsoft sold Windows and Apple controlled Macintosh systems, Linux stood for something different: freedom. It was open source, meaning anyone could look inside, understand how it worked, and make it better. This wasn't just a technical decision, it was a statement. At a time when most of the digital world was being locked down, Linux represented transparency, collaboration, and community ownership. For students, academics, and idealists, it wasn't just software. It was a cause worth supporting. Third, Linux succeeded because of timing. The early 1990s were a turning point for technology. The internet was beginning to expand from research labs into homes and businesses. Suddenly, people all over the world could connect, share files, and collaborate at a scale never seen before. This was exactly the kind of environment an open-source project needed to thrive. Without the internet, Linux might have remained a niche experiment. With it, Linux became the first truly global software movement. Another key factor was the energy of the community. In traditional software companies, updates were slow, expensive, and limited by corporate priorities. In Linux, the community was its heartbeat. Programmers from around the world contributed code, spotted bugs, and shared improvements. Some worked on weekends, others late at night after their day jobs. Each person was motivated not by a paycheck, but by the thrill of solving problems and being part of something bigger. This volunteer army gave Linux a pace of development that no single company could match. Compare this to other attempts. Minix, for example, was an important educational tool, but limited by its creator's vision. It was never meant to be more than a teaching aid. The GNU project had the right philosophy, but lacked a functional kernel. Commercial systems like OS/2 developed by IBM and Microsoft suffered from bloated design and corporate politics. Linux, by contrast, combined the best of all worlds: the technical strength of Unix, the freedom of GNU, and the speed of global collaboration. Of course, Linux also faced challenges. Skeptics doubted that free software could ever be reliable. Critics argued that without a company behind it, Linux would fall apart. But here's where Linus Torvalds' leadership mattered most. Though modest and often blunt, he had a rare ability to keep the project focused. He accepted contributions carefully, maintained quality, and built a culture where technical merit mattered more than status. This meritocracy gave contributors confidence that their work would be valued if it was good, no matter who they were. By the late 1990s, Linux had reached a tipping point. It wasn't just a hobbyist's plaything anymore. It was powering servers, research labs, and soon, major corporations. The open source model had proved itself. And unlike so many failed projects, Linux showed no signs of slowing down. The success of Linux wasn't a fluke. It was the result of perfect alignment. A technically brilliant foundation, a philosophy that inspired loyalty, the explosive growth of the internet, and a leader who understood how to harness a global community. Together, these factors made Linux not just another operating system, but a revolution that redefined what software could be. Chapter 6. The world runs on Linux. If you're watching this video on a smartphone, streaming it through YouTube servers, or browsing on a laptop connected to Wi-Fi, chances are Linux is quietly working behind the scenes. That's the remarkable thing about Linux today. It's everywhere, but it's invisible. Unlike Windows or Mac OS, which people interact with directly, Linux often operates in the background, powering the systems that keep our digital lives running. Let's start with the most familiar device in your pocket, the smartphone. If you own an Android phone, and over 70% of the world's smartphones run Android, you're actually carrying Linux with you every day. Android is built on the Linux kernel. That means millions of people use Linux daily without even realizing it. When you swipe your screen, open an app, or check your messages, you're using technology born from Linus Torvalds' student project. But it doesn't stop there. Behind the apps we use, the websites we visit, and the videos we stream, Linux is the hidden backbone. Web servers, the machines that deliver content across the internet, overwhelmingly rely on Linux. Major companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Netflix run their data centers on Linux because it's stable, secure, and endlessly customizable. Every time you search on Google, scroll on Instagram, or order something from Amazon, Linux is at work. Now consider the world of supercomputers. These are the giants of computing. Massive machines designed to perform trillions of calculations per second, used for everything from climate modeling to genetic research. And here's a staggering fact. As of today, over 90% of the world's top 500 supercomputers run on Linux. Why? Because Linux can be tailored to the exact needs of these complex systems in ways no commercial operating system can. Linux has even reached the stars. Both NASA and SpaceX rely on Linux for missions in space. The International Space Station runs on Linux, after switching away from Windows years ago for greater stability and security. SpaceX rockets, which have redefined space travel, use Linux-based systems for guidance and control. When humanity pushes the boundaries of exploration, Linux is riding along. Then there's finance. Global stock exchanges, banks, and high-frequency trading systems demand reliability and speed. Linux, with its stability and low cost, has become the platform of choice for financial institutions worldwide. Billions of dollars move across systems powered by Linux every single day. What makes Linux so universal is its flexibility. Unlike Windows or Mac OS, which are packaged and sold as complete products, Linux can be shaped to fit almost any purpose. It can run on a smartphone, a smartwatch, a refrigerator, or a car. It can power massive data centers or tiny embedded devices. It's like digital clay, molded by engineers to fit whatever shape they need. And here's the most remarkable part: Linux is still free. Despite powering industries worth trillions of dollars, Linux remains open source. No company owns it. No one can lock it away. Linus Torvalds and the global community of developers have ensured that Linux will always remain accessible to anyone who wants to use or improve it. In other words, the world doesn't just use Linux, it depends on it. From everyday devices to cutting-edge science, from streaming a movie to launching a rocket, Linux has become the quiet force behind modern technology. When Linus Torvalds first posted his modest Usenet message in 1991, he called his project just a hobby. Today, that hobby runs the world. And what makes it even more powerful is that most people don't even know it's there. Linux doesn't need to be in the spotlight. Its success is written into the silent infrastructure of the internet, the devices in our pockets, and the systems that keep society running. Chapter 7. Linus the Reluctant Hero. By the late 1990s, Linux was no longer just a scrappy project written in a student's dorm room. It was powering servers, inspiring conferences, and attracting attention from some of the biggest tech companies in the world. Yet at the center of it all was Linus Torvalds, still the same quiet, stubbornly pragmatic Finn who had started it all. Unlike the charismatic CEOs of Silicon Valley, Linus never played the part of the tech celebrity. He didn't seek headlines, dress in designer suits, or talk about changing the world. In fact, he often seemed uncomfortable with the very idea of fame. Linus once described himself as an engineer, not a visionary. While others hailed him as a revolutionary, he saw himself simply as someone who liked solving technical problems. His humility wasn't fake, it was genuine. He didn't launch Linux to get rich or famous. He launched it because he wanted a better operating system for his PC. That authenticity resonated with people, especially programmers who valued substance over showmanship. But make no mistake, Linus wasn't soft or easily swayed. He had, and still has, a reputation for being blunt, sometimes even abrasive, when reviewing code. In the Linux community, a Linus rejection became almost legendary. He would tell contributors exactly what he thought of their work, often in language that was direct to the point of harshness. Some found this intimidating, others refreshing. But beneath the tough exterior was a simple principle. Quality mattered above all else. Linus wasn't running Linux to win friends, he was running it to build the best system possible. That uncompromising approach kept Linux strong. In a project with thousands of contributors, there was always the risk of chaos, of code becoming inconsistent or unstable. Linus's steady hand prevented that. He became a reluctant leader, someone who never asked for authority but earned it through consistency, fairness, and technical excellence. People followed Linus not because he demanded it, but because they trusted his judgment. Financially, Linus could have cashed in. By the late 1990s, corporations were eager to harness Linux, and there were opportunities to turn it into a commercial empire. But Linus never sold out. He never tried to claim ownership over the project or restrict its use. Instead, he doubled down on the principle that Linux would remain free and open source. This decision made Linux stronger in the long run. Because no single company could own it, no single company could kill it. In this way, Linus stood in stark contrast to the tech moguls of his era. While Bill Gates built Microsoft into a corporate giant and Steve Jobs turned Apple into a cultural icon, Linus quietly shaped the future from the background. He wasn't a billionaire, but he didn't need to be. His creation spoke louder than any fortune could. Over the years, Linus has remained surprisingly ordinary. He lives in the United States with his family, enjoys scuba diving, and still spends much of his time working on Linux. He doesn't tour the world giving flashy talks. He doesn't appear in glossy magazine spreads. To him, Linux was never about ego, it was about engineering. And perhaps that's what makes his story so compelling. Linus Torvalds never set out to be a hero, but he became one anyway. By refusing to compromise on principles, by staying true to his engineer's mindset, he showed the world that you don't need charisma, wealth, or power to make history. Sometimes, all it takes is patience, honesty, and the determination to solve a problem better than anyone else. In a world obsessed with big personalities, Linus became the quiet architect of the digital age. He is the reluctant hero who built a foundation for billions of people and did it without ever craving the spotlight. Chapter 8. Lessons for Us All. When we look back at the story of Linus Torvalds and the creation of Linux, it's tempting to see it as just a piece of tech history. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper meaning. This isn't only about programming or operating systems. It's about what one person's curiosity, persistence, and principles can teach us all. The first lesson is the power of starting small. Linus never set out to build a global phenomenon. He wasn't dreaming of competing with Microsoft or Apple. He simply wanted to solve a problem for himself, making his computer more useful. That small step, driven by personal curiosity, grew into something far larger than he imagined. It reminds us that greatness often begins quietly. You don't have to wait for perfect conditions or massive resources to begin. Sometimes the world's biggest revolutions start with a single person tinkering in their bedroom. The second lesson is the strength of community over individual glory. While Linus wrote the first kernel, Linux became what it is today because of the thousands, eventually millions, of people who joined in. The open source model allowed the project to evolve faster and more